Welcome to Spotlight Murders, the show where we crack open the sealed vaults of history's most baffling mysteries. I'm your host, Kieran Caldwell, and today we're diving into one of the most perplexing and enigmatic deaths of the 20th century, a story woven with empire building, espionage, financial scandal, and a body found drifting in the cold Atlantic Ocean. This is the story of Robert Maxwell, a man who escaped Nazi persecution as a child, transformed himself into a towering media magnate, and then vanished from his yacht under circumstances that still baffle the world. Was his death a tragic accident, a calculated suicide, or was he silenced by shadowy intelligence agencies, forces connected to the very secrets he may have kept? Born Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hoch in 1923, Maxwell's life was a remarkable journey from war-torn Europe to the pinnacle of British publishing. But behind his charismatic public persona lurked a complex man entangled in deceit, power struggles, and mounting financial troubles. Today, I'll take you through the rise and fall of Ian Robert Maxwell, the man who built a global media empire, yet left behind a trail of mystery when he disappeared from his luxury yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, in November 1991. As we unravel the truth, you'll see why his sudden death still haunts investigators, fuels conspiracy theories, and fractures the legacy he left behind, more than 3 decades on. So dim the lights, press play, and join us as we dive deep into the life, lies, and final hours of Robert Maxwell. Because once you hear what happened beneath the surface, you'll never look at headlines the same way again. Let's start at the beginning, because Maxwell's story is nothing if not extraordinary. Born into a Jewish family in Czechoslovakia in 1923, young Jan Hoch's world was shattered by the Nazi occupation. His mother and several family members would perish in Auschwitz, a tragedy that would mark him forever. But Maxwell himself escaped, joining the Czechoslovak army in exile during World War II, before continuing his service with the British Army. Here's where it gets interesting. In 1945, during the Normandy campaign, Maxwell displayed such courage that he was awarded the Military Cross. This wasn't just some refugee survivor. This was a man who had already demonstrated the audacity and fearlessness that would define his entire life. After the war, Maxwell met and married Elizabeth Betty Maynard, and together they would have 9 children. But tragedy seemed to follow him. His daughter Corinne died of leukemia at just 3 years old. His son Michael fell into a coma after a car crash and never recovered, dying 6 years later. These personal sorrows transformed Maxwell into an emotionally guarded patriarch, someone who channeled his pain into relentless ambition, and ambitious he was. Leveraging his allied contacts in occupied Germany, Maxwell launched what would become a remarkable publishing career. He became the British and U.S. distributor for Springer's scientific works, then acquired Butterworth Springer in 1951, rebranding it as Pergamon Press. This was the seed of his empire, a global scientific publishing powerhouse. But Maxwell didn't stop there. He went on to acquire the British Printing Corporation, Mirror Group newspapers, Macmillan Publishers, and other major holdings. His empire spanned continents. During the 1960s, he even served as a Labour Party MP for Buckingham from 1964 to 1970. Though his business practices were already drawing criticism from Britain's Department of Trade and Industry, Maxwell's personal life was as volatile as his business dealings. Affairs, marital discord, relentless rivalries with figures like Rupert Murdoch. He attempted aggressive partnerships, ultimately acquiring the Daily Mirror and later the New York Daily News. The man was everywhere, always making headlines, always generating suspicion. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Years of asset stripping, including the unauthorized use of pension funds, temporarily sustained his ventures, but were sowing the seeds of ruin. By 1991, Maxwell's empire was collapsing under the weight of its own ambition, and his deteriorating physical health mirrored his crumbling financial kingdom. Now we arrive at November 1st, 1991. Robert Maxwell embarked on what would become his final journey aboard the Lady Ghislaine, a magnificent 180 feet super yacht named after his youngest daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell. This wasn't just any boat. It was a floating palace equipped with lavish suites, state-of-the-art satellite communications, and opulent furnishings reflecting Maxwell's larger-than-life persona. But Maxwell was no longer the invincible titan he once appeared to be. His vast business empire teetered on the brink of collapse, the result of fraudulent dealings that were perilously close to being exposed. Adversaries circled, eager to capitalize on his impending downfall. For the first time in his life, Maxwell found himself trapped with no apparent escape. The evening before his disappearance, Maxwell engaged in a heated phone conversation with his son, Kevin, concerning a crucial meeting with the Bank of England. The meeting was intended to address a $50 million loan default. But here's the thing, Maxwell skipped it. He chose instead to continue his journey aboard the Lady Ghislaine toward the Canary Islands. Think about that. A meeting with the Bank of England about $50 million, and he just sailed away. The last confirmed interaction with Maxwell occurred at 4:25 in the morning, local time, on November 5th, during a conversation with the yacht's crew. Earlier that night, crew members observed him pacing the deck, restless beneath the starlit sky. They noted he seemed unusually silent, clearly burdened by the financial avalanche looming over him. Around 3 a.m., some crew members reported hearing what sounded like a disturbance near the yacht's aft section, although no one saw Maxwell after this point. As dawn broke over the small Canary island of La Gomera, where the Lady Ghislaine was anchored, the crew attempted to wake Maxwell. His cabin was empty, but his bathrobe lay neatly folded on the deck, as if he intended to return imminently. Despite a comprehensive search of the yacht, Maxwell was nowhere to be found. Alarmed, the captain issued a distress call at 11:48 a.m. A Spanish Coast Guard helicopter swiftly arrived and discovered a body floating face up in the nearby waters. The grim discovery was confirmed. It was Robert Maxwell, found naked and lifeless. The world was left in shock, grappling with the unexpected loss of a man who had wielded extraordinary power and influence. But the questions were only beginning. At 11 o'clock that morning, anchored near the southern coast of Tenerife, Captain Gus Rankin attempted to connect a telephone call from New York to Maxwell's cabin. When Maxwell didn't answer, Rankin responded with immediate concern. The search took place in all the usual areas, yet Maxwell was nowhere to be found. When Maxwell's body was identified by his widow and eldest son, it was moved for an autopsy at the break of dawn. 4 hours later, the pathologist rendered his verdict. During the autopsy, we discovered significant blockages in the 2 coronary arteries. Our conclusion was that the heart attack likely led to his passing. Case closed, right? Not quite. By the time Maxwell's body was flown to Israel for burial, the initial findings by the pathologist, Lamella, were already under scrutiny. A second autopsy was conducted on the already dissected and embalmed body by Dr. Ian West. He observed, "There isn't evidence of the typical injury pattern consistent with a person who has been physically attacked." When questioned about his final thoughts, West asserted, "Murder appears highly improbable." But here's where it gets confusing. The initial Spanish conclusion stated that death did not result from drowning, due to the lack of water found in the lungs. However, Dr. West contradicted this. In the lungs, there was substantial froth, remarked both the Israeli pathologist and West. This was consistent with drowning. Despite these observations, West added, "I suspect drowning is likely the cause of death, but I cannot definitively prove it." So what do we have? Blocked coronary arteries suggesting a heart attack could have incapacitated Maxwell, possibly leading to an accidental fall into the sea, either unconscious or debilitated. The frothy fluid present in the lungs, a classic hallmark of drowning, suggested Maxwell had inhaled water prior to his death. Importantly, no external injuries or trauma were found, which would typically be associated with a violent altercation. But the discrepancies between the Spanish report and the second autopsy sparked intense debates. Did the heart attack occur before or after the drowning? Was this an accident, suicide, or something more sinister? And here's the kicker. Maxwell had never learned to swim and was known for his intense fear of drowning. So how did a man terrified of water end up naked in the ocean? Let's examine the first theory, suicide. And we have a pretty notable proponent of this theory, Rupert Murdoch, Maxwell's longtime rival. Murdoch recalls being in Los Angeles when he received a call informing him that Maxwell had vanished from his yacht. His immediate reaction? He jumped. In Murdoch's view, Maxwell was acutely aware that financial institutions were closing in on him, recognizing the enormity of his actions, and thus took drastic measures. The logic goes like this. Maxwell knew his predicament was insurmountable. Returning to London would have spelled catastrophe, financial ruin, public disgrace, and a very real threat of incarceration. While Maxwell projected a robust exterior, he was known to care profoundly about his standing and reputation. The potential of losing everything he had painstakingly built over the years might have been an unbearable prospect. Financial commentators and investigators noted that the swift disintegration of Maxwell's business empire would likely have led to immediate financial ruin and criminal indictments. Given his pride and fixation with his public image, the shame of a trial and conviction might have been untenable. Furthermore, his penchant for controlling situations and scripting his narrative could support the theory that he meticulously chose the timing and manner of his death to dodge full accountability. Forensic assessments highlighted a lack of evidence indicating a struggle or foul play. His body was discovered floating close to his yacht in relatively calm waters. Specialists proposed that his deteriorating health and growing paranoia might have pushed him into a despairing state. It's documented that Maxwell was under significant strain as probes into his financial activities intensified, and whispered accounts alluded to episodes of profound depression in the months preceding his death. Those close to him said his mental well-being was fragile, marked by anxiety and sleeplessness, and that he was increasingly withdrawn. Some analysts noted Maxwell's erratic conduct in the weeks leading up to his demise, unusual nighttime phone calls, and secret meetings, as potential signs of planning to escape impending disaster. But here's the problem with the suicide theory. Maxwell's own family doesn't buy it. Betty Maxwell, his wife, steadfastly maintained that her husband would never choose to end his life, though she privately conceded her uncertainties. Maxwell's children also considered their father's death an accident, arguing that suicide was not in his nature, noting his history of resilience and belief in his ability to recover, no matter how dire the circumstances appeared. With one notable exception, Ghislaine Maxwell has consistently believed in the murder theory, and no suicide note was ever found. While some suggest Maxwell might have orchestrated the act without leaving explicit confirmation, sowing seeds for ambiguity, the lack of a note is significant. This was a man who controlled narratives, who scripted everything. Would he really leave without a final word? The fact that Maxwell was a non-swimmer with a well-known fear of drowning has been paradoxically cited both as evidence against the suicide claim and as a tragic facet of it. Would a man terrified of water choose drowning as his method? Or does that fear make it the ultimate desperate last act? Now let's get into the really intriguing stuff, the assassination theories. And to understand these, we need to talk about Maxwell's shadowy connections to intelligence agencies. Maxwell's escape from Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia remains clouded in mystery. According to one theory, Maxwell was smuggled out of Nazi-allied Croatia by communist partisans. In return for their help, Maxwell supposedly agreed to serve the Soviet secret police, known first as the NKVD and later as the KGB. This theory posits that Maxwell's journey from refugee to British publishing magnate and politician was not merely a tale of survival and ambition, but a calculated mission orchestrated by Soviet intelligence. The NKVD, it is claimed, strategically placed Maxwell in Britain as an agent of influence. Once there, he exceeded their expectations by first joining the British Army, which granted him both respected status and access to sensitive information. Following his military service, Maxwell established Pergamon Press, which quickly became influential in academic and scientific circles. The NKVD allegedly brokered deals between Pergamon Press and publishers in the Eastern Bloc. His later election as a Labour Member of Parliament further cemented his position, giving him access to political corridors where intelligence and influence intertwined. But then there's the Israeli angle. For years, Maxwell was rumored to have ties with Mossad, with some believing he was an asset working for the Israelis. Conspiracy theorists argue that Mossad's relationship with Maxwell soured dramatically when the agency uncovered his true allegiance, that Maxwell had been a Soviet spy all along, playing both sides, but ultimately betraying Israeli trust. And here's where it gets wild. Reports claim that Maxwell attempted to blackmail the Israeli government over top-secret computer software he had allegedly been marketing on their behalf. Maddened by this betrayal, the theory goes, Mossad sent a crack team of assassins to shadow the Lady Ghislaine. At dead of night, they boarded the yacht, where they injected Maxwell with a lethal poison before tipping him into the water. Some versions of this theory propose that Mossad dispatched an underwater assassination team to sabotage Maxwell's yachting holiday near the Canary Islands. This fits into a broader pattern of Mossad's covert operations worldwide, ranging from kidnappings to assassinations, including the famous capture of former Nazi officer Adolf Eichmann in South America. But there's another layer. Before his demise, Maxwell made frequent trips to Moscow, ostensibly seeking financial aid. Was he attempting to escape the financial collapse in the West, or was he engaging in a dangerous balancing act, trying to play both Western and Eastern powers against one another? Some suggest that these high-risk maneuvers made him a target for powerful interests from multiple directions. With deep ties to intelligence agencies and rumored involvement as an Israeli intelligence asset in covert operations and arms deals, Maxwell could have known too much, leading someone to silence him permanently. Skeptics doubt Maxwell voluntarily plunged into the ocean, suggesting instead that he was pushed. The assassination theory has its appeal. Maxwell's clandestine activities and perilous political associations lend credence to it. However, Dr. Ian West's autopsy conclusion that murder appears highly improbable due to the lack of typical injury patterns is a significant counterpoint. Unless, of course, we're talking about sophisticated poisoning that mimicked a heart attack, which is precisely what some conspiracy theorists propose. And now for the most outlandish theory of all, that Robert Maxwell faked his own death. Given his history of deceit, fraud, and manipulation, some propose that Maxwell orchestrated the entire event to vanish and start over, free from the burdens of his scandals. After all, this was a man who had reinvented himself before, who had clawed his way back from disgrace 2 decades earlier. Think about it. A man who controlled narratives, who manipulated media empires, who had connections across the globe. Could he have staged the ultimate disappearing act? The neatly folded bathrobe on the deck, the absence of a body for hours, the contradictory autopsy reports. Could these all be part of an elaborate ruse? But this theory prompts critical questions. If he did stage his death, where did he go? Why has no definitive proof ever surfaced to support this notion? And perhaps most importantly, how did he manage to fool not just Spanish authorities and rescue teams, but also his own wife and children who identified the body? The fake death theory requires an enormous conspiracy involving multiple parties, falsified autopsy reports, and cooperation from people who would have had no reason to help Maxwell escape. It would mean the body pulled from the water was somehow not Maxwell's, or that the identification process was somehow corrupted. Despite sounding far-fetched to most, Maxwell's life was marked by bizarre twists and fantastical tales. He was a man who seemed capable of anything, who had survived Nazi occupation, built an empire from nothing, and maintained alleged connections with multiple intelligence agencies simultaneously. If anyone could pull off faking their own death, wouldn't it be Robert Maxwell? But the weight of evidence suggests otherwise. The body was identified by family members. Multiple autopsies were conducted. The simpler explanations, accident or suicide, require far fewer assumptions than an elaborate staged death. So where does all this leave us? More than 3 decades after Robert Maxwell's body was pulled from the Atlantic Ocean, we're still asking the same questions. The official verdict combined a heart attack with accidental drowning. The Spanish authorities concluded his death was either a tragic accident or potentially a suicide, with no evidence of foul play or visible signs of struggle. Dr. Ian West's second autopsy supported this, finding no typical injury patterns consistent with physical attack. But the inconsistencies remain troubling. The conflicting reports about water in the lungs, the blocked coronary arteries suggesting heart attack versus the frothy fluid suggesting drowning. The question of whether the cardiac event occurred before or after he entered the water. The fact that a non-swimmer with a fear of drowning ended up naked in the ocean. And then there are the witness reports that added to the confusion, varying accounts with some claiming Maxwell had inhaled water, indicating he was alive before entering the sea, while others reported he was lifeless before hitting the water. Maxwell's tragic and unresolved passing continues to captivate historians, biographers, and conspiracy theorists. The man who escaped the Nazis, who built a publishing empire, who served in parliament, who allegedly worked for multiple intelligence agencies, who defrauded pension funds and built a house of cards that inevitably collapsed, this man's final chapter remains shrouded in mystery. In death, as in life, Maxwell left behind a legacy of scandal, sensationalism, and a family struggling to reclaim dignity amid public disgrace. His daughter Ghislaine still believes he was murdered. His wife Betty went to her grave uncertain about what really happened that night aboard the Lady Ghislaine. His children, grappling with both grief and the revelation of their father's massive fraud, have had to construct their own narratives about how and why he died. What we know for certain is this. On November 5th, 1991, Robert Maxwell's body was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean near the Canary Islands. The yacht he'd been aboard, named after his daughter, became the scene of one of the 20th century's most enduring mysteries. Whether he jumped, fell, was pushed, or orchestrated an escape, Robert Maxwell's death was as dramatic and controversial as the life he led. The story of Robert Maxwell is ultimately a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition, the corrosive effects of fraud, and the price of living in the shadows. It's about a man who survived unimaginable horrors only to create new ones. A man who built empires only to see them crumble. A man who may have served multiple masters and ultimately served none. Was his death an accident? A heart attack victim who fell overboard? Was it suicide? A desperate man choosing the ocean over disgrace? Was it assassination? A betrayer silenced by those he betrayed? Or was it the greatest con of all, a fraudster's final trick? We may never know the truth, but perhaps that's fitting for a man whose entire life was built on secrets, manipulation, and the careful construction of competing narratives. Thanks for joining me on Spotlight Murders as we unraveled the mysterious life and death of Robert Maxwell. His story is one of power, secrets, and shadows that still linger today. But there's so much more beneath the surface. Hidden details, never before shared insights, and the latest investigations that we just couldn't fit here. To dive deeper into Robert Maxwell's death and explore other chilling cases, be sure to download the Skoob app, available now on the Play Store and App Store. With exclusive content, extended interviews, and behind-the-scenes revelations, Skoob takes you beyond the headlines and into the heart of history's darkest mysteries. Until next time, I'm Kieran Caldwell, and remember, sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. Stay curious and keep seeking the stories that others don't dare to tell.